This is the Lekker Rugby interview with the 8-9 Combo's Brett McKay.
The 8-9 was an idea that we'd had, and it just kind of fit the devious, conniving, willing to get away with anything. 8 being kept in the line by a straight down the line 9. What people may not actually know is that Harry and I didn't meet in person until September this year. It certainly feels like Australian rugby needs Joe to stick around. Everything going towards 2027 right now, I think South Africa are going to stay very much in the favouritism conversation for the next 3 years.
It's my honour to welcome Brett McKay. How's it, Brett? Welcome on the Lekker Rugby pod.
Thank you very much for having me, MV. It's very nice of you. I'm quite humbled that there's a few questions out and about because certainly from my end, it's this: what's this Harry Jones character like? And I went, what you see is what you get. So I'm curious, I suppose, that a few questions have fallen my way, but happy to have a chat because you've been a great supporter of ours all year, and we thank you for it. So happy to contribute in this little way directly now.
No, it's a pleasure. It's nice talking to you as well for the first time in person. Actually, we've been WhatsApping and everything else, but never met you and never spoken to you before. So let's start with that. The 8-9 combo is not the first time you and Harry did podcasting together. Tell me a bit about your history with Harry specifically, because that sort of ties you and me together to a degree. How did that happen? How did you guys meet up, and how did you get into rugby podcasting? I sort of fell into it, to be honest. So I was just curious to know what happened with you guys.
Yeah, we didn't quite fall into it, but I've got to say it was all Harry's idea. So our history goes back a good few years now, and it's probably a decade or more. We've ended up on the same international rugby WhatsApp group, and there's 7 or 8 of us dotted from different parts of the world around, and this is where I come across this Harry Jones character, and I think he'd already started writing for the Raw, the Australian site, by then. If he wasn't writing, he was definitely a long-term commenter. So that was where we first sort of come into contact, and I'd been a writer for them for a good few years at that point. And then a few years ago, Harry said to me at the end of one season, he said, "We should do a podcast together." And my reaction was, "Oh yeah," and I didn't give it too much more thought than that. I didn't give it too much more thought than that. And he was, I wouldn't say he was persistent, but he was certainly keen. He was certainly eager, and his thinking was that he knew that I had a broadcasting background. He knew that I was a bit of a planner and a bit of a spreadsheet and all that. So he sort of figured in his way that I might be the perfect foil for the way he wants to carry on about rugby. And so I didn't give it too much more thought than that. But it wasn't until the editor of the Raw got in touch with me and he says, "This podcast idea of Harry's." And I went, "Oh yeah." And he said, "I think it might have some legs." I was like, "Oh, okay, this is serious." And so it all just sort of started from there, and we sort of gave it a bit of thought as to what we wanted to do. And I sort of said, well, we need to have a little bit of structure about this, because I didn't want to listen to, an hour of myself blathering on each week. We need, let's actually have a way of doing this sort of thing. And that was my radio brain, producer brain working that way as well. But we quickly worked out that we actually had something that kind of worked, and we were really blown away by the way the podcast grew, particularly over the 2 years and into the 23 World Cup. But at the same time, we also knew that the way we wanted to go with the podcast was deviating away from what the Raw wanted. And so we sort of had a thought, I think this might be the time. If we're going to do it for ourselves, this is probably the time to do it. And so it all just sort of fell into place. And the 8-9 was an idea that we'd had, and it just kind of fit. The devious, conniving, willing to get away with anything 8 being kept into line by a, straight down the line 9, leave your head in the scrum, Okay, now let's go. So our personalities kind of fit. But what people may not actually know is that Harry and I didn't meet in person until September this year. So the Sydney Bledisloe Cup test was the first time we'd actually met in person. So by that point, we'd been going nearly 3 years. I'd say to that stage, upwards of 180 pods together. and as you would know, MV, countless messages and calls and everything like that in the background. So we certainly feel like we'd got to know each other pretty well by that point. And then to actually spend a weekend together in Sydney this year was actually kind of cool. And to emerge out of that, still happy to talk to each other and still good mates. And here we are now at the end of our first season on the 8-9, and it's been fantastic. We've just been blown away by the amount of support that we've got from all around the world, but particularly in South Africa. And I make a point of saying that because we have to reluctantly say that we are now YouTubers. We certainly weren't when we set out at the start of this year, but we realized that, and it was around the Rugby Championship, suddenly the numbers just blew up. And that was actually when Harry said to me, funnily enough, South Africans like a visual representation. And that I certainly didn't expect that. And so our YouTube numbers have just gone off. And we've actually had to think about now how we present that, how we look and feel and all that sort of thing. So it's been a year of lessons learned and of growth and fun along the way as well.
It's interesting that you mentioned that YouTube side of it versus the Spotify, Apple Podcast kind of a thing. People don't realize that you're actually huge on those two platforms, and YouTube is sort of an add-on. You did it as a bit of fun. And like you just said, then the numbers started exploding. We had you on our podcast, our channel as well. And that's how people got to know you from our sort of audience.
Yeah.
Why did you decide? Because in South Africa, the audio side of it is minute. The YouTube side of it is huge. It's the other way around. How did it happen, falling into the audio side of it and more than the video side? I'd just explain that a bit to me as well.
Yeah, it was more about my skill set. So as I mentioned, my background's broadcasting, and I've done a lot of radio work and radio producing and editing and all that. So I can edit audio. That's no problem. I've worked in TV, but I very quickly worked out my limitations was around, pictures and sound and editing and all that sort of thing. And I said to camera operators, editors and all that for 5 years whilst I worked for the ABC here in Australia, I'll do words, you guys take care of pictures. So I know the concept, and I'm actually starting to try and upskill myself in terms of video editing, but I still do not proclaim to be a video editor of any sort. So us concentrating on the podcast side of things was more about my limitations as a producer. So, and even now, the video that we put up on YouTube is pretty raw. We're able to do a few things, production wise while we record essentially, but what the video is going up is pretty much what we record. So, but we also think that kind of works for us. If people want, broadcast quality, there's hundreds of options out there, and that's not what we do. So, that's something that we've thought about, and we're trying to sort of work out where we sit. But YouTube is by accident, I would say, is how we would describe it. Yeah. It's actually a bit of a running joke now that we have to say, when you hear us on the pod say, because now we are YouTubers, we're taking the piss out of each other as much as we are about the whole idea.
Yeah, that explains it a lot. People ask me now, you often would have an introduction and say, and this is how it happened or something like that, and there is nothing. Because you didn't include the audio clip or something like that, and you're waiting for it on YouTube. It's not happening. So that's why. That's
right. That's exactly why. Yeah, but because we're producing audio first, and in the audio, there is that clip there. So yes, that's absolutely a limitation of my ability as video editor. But now that we know that there is definitely an audience on YouTube, and often it's 2 or 3 times the audience of the audio pod. We do have to think about that sort of thing now. So we sort of realize now that we maybe can't do that sort of thing in the audio, because ultimately we don't want to do 2 lots of edit. That's what it comes down to.
Well, let me tell you this. I've got a couple of editing tricks up my sleeve from, learning the hard way through necessity, because, like yourself, it's me, myself, and I. That's the entire team. So, apart from Harry's creative input, the rest of it needs to be done. So I figured I'll give you some hints if you want to, drop me
Good.
a
No,
message.
I'll
Not a
I'll
problem.
mine you. I'll mine you for ideas
Yeah.
afterwards.
No, just sort of shortcuts and ways to do it, but you have to keep your wits about it, because what I did the other day, and I'll give you a bit of a hint here. I edit my videos at 200%. I said put the speed at 200%.
Ah, yes.
But then,
Yes.
I sometimes forget to put it back. So it's like I've got Mickey Mouse on the podcast
Yeah.
or something. So it's quite funny.
Tricks for young players. Yeah.
Yeah, it's just time, Like Harry and I would often have a meeting, let's say starting at 3 o'clock, finish about 4:30, and by 6 o'clock it's got to be up on YouTube. So I tell you what, that's pushing the limit a bit.
It's pushing it, yeah.
Yeah.
So us spending the weekend in Sydney as we did, Harry actually got a pretty immediate, a pretty first-hand lesson in what actually happens after we stop on the recording, and he nicked downstairs to the press conferences and all that, and came back up, and I actually thought he'd come back up in between the two, and I was just about done. I was thinking, this is good, I'll actually get down to me at the press conference. But then I find out that both press conferences actually been and gone, and I'd managed to turn it around pretty quickly, but he's actually sat there for the last maybe 5 minutes of it all going live, and then he goes, okay, right, now I understand. This is what's going on here. So yeah, you got a nice little lesson on to what happens on the production side of things.
I don't know about you, but what was interesting to me when I first met Harry, I just basically got to know him about a month or so after we first met and started doing the Lekker Rugby pod. He was here for the first Irish test, or the Irish test.
Yeah.
He was here for both of them. And I met him here in Pretoria, very close to where I live. And it's, you get to know this guy. I've also done over 50 podcasts with him now, and I know him. I know his little quirks and his mannerisms. But when you actually meet someone in person, like you just did, I saw the video when you first you met up physically with each other. It's still a little weird, isn't it? Weird compared to, I know this guy, but I don't actually know him. It's such a weird experience.
It was funny because I know he's a sizable guy. He's a former number 8. I knew there was going to be a size advantage there, but what I think he didn't realize is that I was maybe a bit taller than he thought. So when he's hit me in the midriff, I've bent over pretty well, and so it looked probably a little bit more physical on the streets of North Sydney than it was.
All right, let's talk about you though. I had to go look up. I don't know Australia that well. Many of my schoolmates and friends and family live in Australia, Brisbane or Perth. I know about Canberra. Actually, my best friend at school lived in Canberra. I'm not sure what happened to him in the meantime. IT guy. And I think I look on the map. Where on earth is Canberra? And what is Canberra? What would you say Canberra is like? If you've ever been to South Africa, can you draw a comparison so we can have an idea? Cape Town is sort of like Sydney, maybe. What's Canberra like?
I've not been to South Africa, so I won't try and make that. I won't try and make that comparison. Although Pretoria is probably close. Canberra's the national capital, so it's a lot of government's probably the dominant industry, but by no means as dominant as it once was. So I've lived in Canberra the best part of 30 years now, pretty much straight out of university in country New South Wales. But yeah, the Canberra's nearly doubled in size since I lived here. So it's a big city. It's nearly 500,000 people now. So it's a big part of this sort of southeastern region of New South Wales. We're about 3.5 hours sort of southwest of Sydney, pretty much directly south. We're about maybe 2 hours, 150 kilometres inland off the New South Wales south coast. We're a good distance further north of Melbourne, though. So Canberra's a bit of a way. Canberra was created a bit over 100 years ago. Centenary was about nearly 10 years ago now. Canberra was created very much because Sydney and Melbourne were arguing as to who should be the capital of Australia, and so Canberra was the fallback, was the compromise, if you like. I moved to Canberra because I had no interest in going to Sydney and Melbourne. I'm a country boy. Grew up in the middle of New South Wales in farming lands out there, and went away to school, went to university. So each step for me has been, about growing in population. So where we went to university, a place called Wagga Wagga, which is again out west of Canberra. That was a big city for me, 50, 60,000 people at the time. So yeah, Canberra was the next step, but that was as big as I wanted to get. And so I did IT at uni, worked in government IT over here for 15 years until my mid-30s, and I just got very, very bored in IT, and I was, spending lots of times on sports website. I've always been sport mad, played cricket up until about this time that I made the career change, funnily enough. My actual football and rugby career is very much limited to schoolboy level. Injuries and lack of ability sort of curtailed that pretty early on. But about the time we moved to Canberra was the start of Super Rugby. So the Brumbies very quickly became our team. I grew up playing rugby league, didn't play a lot of rugby, but enough to enjoy it. And then when we came to Canberra, it was just very easy to get into and follow the rugby and follow the Brumbies, particularly because it was a pretty hot team back then. And have just loved the game really ever since. So my background in rugby is very much professionalism, essentially. And then, as I say, mid-30s, started a bit of a career change, started writing as a bit of a hobby almost. And that just sort of grew and went freelancing for a few years when I decided to make the career change. That then opens up a few doors. I started doing more with the ABC here in Canberra, doing commentary work for them on cricket and rugby. Started working in local radio. That then leads to a TV sport job for nearly 5 years. And now I've been working in sort of sport comms, communications and media for the last few years as well. So, but yeah, it's very much it's very much doing something that I love doing. Writing something I enjoy. Talking about rugby is just about the best job in the world. And when I do commentary, I'm the sideline guy for ABC Sport here in Canberra for Brumbies games, and it's just the best way to watch a game. It's fantastic. Sometimes I'm literally meters away from the action, and the things that you see behind the play, the things that you see on the bench, the things that you see, off the ball. You don't get that on TV. And so I just think sometimes, despite how cold it might be at Canberra Stadium, sometimes it's just the best seat in the house. And so, in terms of rugby, I do very much love what I do. And the natural progression from commentary and radio has been podcasting for me. So even though I don't now work in radio, podcasting is very much me getting my radio fixed.
Got a lot of things I want to tell you about from what you just told me. First thing I want to tell you is typical South African fashion. We had 2 capitals or 3 cities competing to be the capital, so we chose all 3. We just gave each one a different title, settlement. We always come to some sort of an understanding. The other thing was very interesting to me, this midlife almost career change that you made, because I'm very much in a similar boat. I just did it much later in life, as you can see by all the grey hair that I've got here. That's interesting to me. How did you end up in radio specifically? You mentioned you had a bit of a radio background. ABC is now the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, I assume. Yep. How did that happen? I mean, you didn't go from an IT specialist in a government department to a guy working in radio just by accident. No. I know you said freelance and everything, but yeah, tell me about that.
So, as I said, I'd been doing a bit of commentary and I'd probably been doing commentary on rugby particularly, but a little bit of cricket as well for probably 5 years or so. And I was often, the go-to talking head for when the local programs needed someone to talk about sport. They knew they could sort of wheel me in for 10 minutes and fill a spot. And then one of their producers and the local radio manager said to me one day, have you thought about this producing things? And the pitch was literally, stuff about stuff. And I sort of thought, oh, yeah, all right, I'll give that a go. And I'm glad I did, because I actually came to love that side of live broadcasting very, very quickly. And that was just a great opportunity to learn on the job and learn how radio works. And that definitely helps the broadcasting side of things, because I'll go to games now, and my preparation for games now is very much as a producer. I'm getting my commentary notes and things like that together, but I've also got a rough plan for how we'll cover the night, and we know that we need to go. We know that we need to come on at this particular point. We know we've got to fill 25 minutes before kickoff. So have a couple of interviews ready to go. Have a couple of talk points ready to go. We know at halftime we've got to throw to our host studio for 5 minutes of news, and we know that they'll come back with some highlights. So then we know that we've got 4 or 5 minutes to fill before they come back on for the second half, and then post match is me out on the ground with the players doing a couple of interviews, and we're wrapping up the game. So that learning opportunity in radio has been fantastic for me. And then, as I say, that then led to a move into the newsroom side of things. And it was probably pitched at me to do radio and writing, but almost out of necessity, I fell into TV. But managed to find a way of making TV work as well. Although I avoided my failing as a TV reporter was that I couldn't do a piece to camera and didn't enjoy doing them, so I avoided them at all costs. And that was mainly because you've got to set your own pace. But for a live cross, I could nail. And there was a night Australia were playing I think it was a 2020 international, something like that, at Manuka Oval here in Canberra. And I was the guy on the ground. I did 8 live crosses back to back over the space of an hour and said pretty much the same thing 8 times. But, live TV, live radio and all that, I love that sort of thing. The challenge of knowing what you've got to say, knowing how long 90 seconds is, knowing your timing, that's a challenge that not everyone can do, I'll admit, but I really enjoy it and I love getting it right.
Oh, I tried a few lives, and I tell you what, that's nerve-wracking. Because number one, I need to take care of the technical stuff, and I need to sort of appear like I know what I'm talking about, even though I don't often don't do. And then I just have to point him in the direction, and then he goes off. But that live thing is completely different animal to sitting here and recording it. Different.
It is, yeah. I'll give you a few little insights into our test match post-mortem. So we record those pretty close to full time, within 10 or 15 minutes generally. And so the last probably 20 minutes of a game, we're throwing messages back and forward saying, I think we're on at a quarter past. I think we're on at 20 past. So we're giving ourselves enough time. I've pre-written script to a point, but obviously I've got to fill in the blanks, score, description, line, that sort of thing. So I've got pretty good at that. When we were including clips, I've sort of very quickly got to try and record that little clip so it's ready to go, so it's not too much work to do afterwards. We record, and then I'm pretty much straight into the edit. And the goal, ideally, is that we can turn it around and actually have it out, within an hour or so of starting to record. And that's a fair bit of work. And so, that's on a one-off weekend, that's okay. Rugby World Cup last year, tell you what, by the end of it, I was ready for bed. 2 months of and at all hours of the morning it was for me too. So it was I was living very much at 3 and 4 a.m. often. So busy times. But again, that's working to a deadline, working to a bit of a live schedule. So I love making that work, even though sometimes it's more difficult than it needs to be.
Yeah, but I never thought about the fact that you're sort of in a different time zone. I know you are, but I didn't realize the World Cup was in our time zone. So for me, it wasn't that difficult. I remember I was dead after that World Cup, and I didn't do half what you guys did. It's interesting.
Yeah, well, so I was going to, I think the last Wallabies game, the last couple of Wallabies games were 4 and 5 a.m. kickoff for me on the eastern coast of Australia, eastern time zone, sorry. So we do instant reaction afterwards. So I'm sort of throwing together some breakfast, have a quick shower, and then I was off to work. I was still managing a day job, and so it was for the best part of 2 months. It was a bit of a zombie existence.
You mentioned the fact that you love being at the stadium. I must be honest, I don't really like that because I missed too much of the game. That's the thing.
Yeah.
Especially at Loftus, sort of my cathedral, if you want to call it that. I have to sit in the press box. It's in the northwest corner. It's behind glass. You miss the atmosphere. You miss most of the game. I like talking to the coaches and stuff afterwards. I like building that kind of relationship with people, meeting the guys, and that I like. But the game itself, I prefer to watch it on TV, hear what the TMO is saying, what the ref is saying.
Yes.
I get so much more out of the game there, but I do miss the atmosphere. Although Loftus is now sort of turned into a kind of a 70s disco thing with Sweet Caroline all over again. But that's sort of my angle, I think, too. It's interesting that you say that.
Yeah, it's true. Certainly when I watch, like when I'm pitch side for a Super Rugby game, we're getting all of that. So I feel like I'm right involved in that. But then when I watch a game on TV, it's definitely a different feel. You're seeing more of things, but you're seeing more of it obviously because it's on TV. When I'm then in July, we went up to Sydney and I took my daughter to watch the first Australia Wales test, and that was the first time I'd been to a test match that I wasn't working at for maybe 10 years or so. We just sat at the end of the field not quite behind the goalpost, but behind the try line, and just watched. And that was a very different feel for me because I didn't have voices in my headphones or didn't have TMO. I didn't have, wasn't taking notes. So like it was a very, very different feel for me. And so, when you become so used to covering games a certain way, when you suddenly aren't able to do that and you're watching a game live, it's really different. But it was nice to do that because suddenly I started noticing, and you guys you've probably heard me mention it a few times this year. Suddenly I realized, the way Joe Schmidt does a pre-game warm-up was certainly different to what Dave Rennie had done before. It's different to the way Super Rugby guys do it. And, you notice the little things. You notice Jeff Parling standing above at the very top of an 8-foot step ladder, fully extended, taking line-out throws. Now, I don't think even at the height of his playing career, Jeff Parling was ever taking line-out throws effectively 2.5 meters in the air, but there he was. And that was obviously something that they'd worked on. And so, noticing little details like that was really interesting to see.
I actually noticed that myself, and I've talked to Harry about it. Yeah, at Loftus, they do exactly that. They use an airplane trolley. Yeah, and then it's amazing. I couldn't believe how high those guys actually jump. It's you don't realize it when they just do the jumping and they get lifted and the likes. But when you actually put it into perspective next to a ladder, then it's sort of wow. I never realized that. Yeah, that's interesting. I like that. I like that kind of thing.
Years ago, I went over to Wellington. The Brumbies played the Hurricanes in a semi-final, and I flew into Wellington a few days early. I was doing some work for ESPN at the time, so I'd actually teed up a few interviews beforehand and did a few articles and all that before the game. And one of them was with Chris Boyd, who was the Hurricanes coach at the time, and very much rocked in at the end of their captain's run. Chris come up and greeted me, was really, really good, really giving him his time. And we sat just behind the dead ball line, having a bit of a chat and finished doing what we were doing. And we're still having a chat. And then suddenly Dane Coles gets one of the assistant coaches, and the assistant coach comes up to where we're sitting. We're about 5 or 6 rows from the front. But suddenly from ground level, Dane Coles is whizzing line-out throws up to this assistant coach. And the assistant coach has taken the ball in front of his face. But same sort of the elevation and all that, he's probably 3 meters, I suppose, off ground level. And I'll still remember the fizz on the ball that Dane Coles is getting in these line-out throws was mesmerizing, hypnotizing almost to watch. And I remember saying to Chris, he does this a lot, doesn't he? And he goes, he'll do it for half an hour after a captain's run if you let him. Sometimes we've just got to say, mate, you're throwing him fine, just go. But I've always found those little moments, those little interactions, those little things that you notice, that's the fascinating part of how teams and coaches and players prepare for games.
I talked to you about rugby. I wanted to ask you, your other love is cricket. You mentioned it in passing a little bit. If tell us about that a bit. And if you had to choose between rugby and cricket, which would be your favorite?
So I actually worked in cricket. I finished up a stint in cricket just fairly recently, and I said when I went into that rugby's what I love, but cricket's what I played, and so cricket was what I really knew. And even after a 10 or 12 year break since I finished playing, getting back to working in cricket, there was still it was still the game is still the same. Yeah, obviously it's it's professional and that, but the game is still the game. I never had that reaction, that relationship with rugby, if you like, because the very, very low level schoolboy rugby that I played is nothing like a professional game now. So it would be a hard choice if I had to choose one, because they're both very big parts of my life, but they're also different parts of my life, if you like. Cricket was what I did growing up as a kid, right up till my mid 30s. My daughter was 6 weeks old, I think, when I played my last game, and she's middle way through high school now, so she's got no memory of me playing. There's a few photos on the wall, but that's about it. But she has always, for her whole life, I've been involved in rugby. So it's two very different parts of my life. So that doesn't really answer your question.
No, it does.
Which is, but it's, yeah. I've always played sport. I've always watched sport. I've always loved sport. And so, I think as a kid, I grew up wanting to play for Australia in something, and that quickly became apparent that probably wasn't going to happen. Sometimes talent and ability doesn't get handed out in equal shares. But I've found a way to be involved in sport and to have a life in sport. And as I have been saying to people for 15 years now, there are far worse ways of making a living than what I do.
I want to talk to you about that. In South Africa, I grew up with rugby and cricket. And to this day, I would say my favorite memories of growing up would be listening to the Boxing Day cricket test match on the radio, not watching it on TV, listening to it on the radio. And actually, one of my best memories was I went to Botswana for December. I drove back and I listened to the radio on the first day. I watched the second day on TV, and I watched the last 3 days at Newlands in Cape Town. So it was against India. But you know what? As much as rugby blossomed in South Africa into this incredible sport with all the support and unifying nature, cricket has withered and died on the stem, if that's the word. It's just died. It's gone. I don't know what the problem is. I don't even know who's playing for South Africa anymore. David de Villiers, everybody's gone. I know a couple of the names. Such an interesting thing. You mentioned rugby having competition with league and everything else. Cricket just died in South Africa, and it's such a travesty, almost such a tragedy. That's such, and I miss that. I miss those days.
And we miss it as well, because again, you go back 15 and 20 years, and the Australia-South Africa rivalry in cricket was very real. There was at the time, if Australia was number one, then South Africa weren't far off it, and so there was some fantastic tests played in that time. And so I agree with you. It's a shame. It's a shame the way it has fallen off, but it's also apparent in the cricket world, where the strong economies are, and as much as South Africa and Sri Lanka and Pakistan and the West Indies love cricket, the economic realities are that the national game for them just doesn't bring the returns anymore. And so unfortunately it means the franchise leagues is where the game is at in those countries.
Talking about stuff withering on the vine, your t-shirt there, Super Rugby, and then moving into Australia, national test rugby and the likes. What do you think about the South Africans moving out of Super Rugby or being kicked out of Super Rugby? Do you think it honestly had such a big effect? What's the state of Super Rugby at the moment?
It's definitely not where it was. There's no question about that. South Africa leaving Super Rugby has felt like it's been a long time coming. It's something that was often threatened, and there were certainly times where I've thought, well, go on then, leave. What's the worst thing can happen? I think we're actually starting to see the worst thing that can happen, and we hear Super Rugby, as good as it is for the Australian sides to test against New Zealand so regularly, every weekend. You can get used to a certain playing style. That's certainly true, and the converse of that is that the URC, the ERC, as we lovingly refer to it, and that's
it irks
very
people
much,
that Harry says irked, by the way.
yeah, he does. We get chipped on it every now and again, and we just blame Rian Lowe for that one.
Ringo, yeah, I talked to him last week.
We've thrown that very much at Ringo's feet. But the Irk has become. I didn't watch a lot of the Pro 14. Well, it's actually, even as the Irk, it's actually hard to watch, to see in Australia. It's not on any. It's difficult to get to. But I certainly didn't watch a lot of the Pro 14. But the little bits that I did see of it, it was a lesser level, premiership rugby, essentially. But now that South African teams have jumped into it, there's different levels of physicality in that. And you're seeing that the Irish teams are saying, well, all right, we've got to step up in this front if we're going to be better. I think, certainly the Scottish teams are realising that. Wales is in a bit of a state. Italy does their best at the best of times. But the Irk has really transformed with the South African teams being involved there. And maybe the best measurement of that is the fact that the Premiership wants to try and fashion some sort of merger, which, that's probably another chat for another day. Super Rugby is in a really funny spot now. It's very much being run as a joint venture between Australia and New Zealand, but it's got too much of a feeling of afterthought about it, and everything is geared toward the Wallabies and the All Blacks. And Super Rugby has almost become this 6 month of the year, first half of the year inconvenience at times. There's test players being rested, and there's camps in January and April, and everything's just sort of geared towards Super Rugby. I think they're trying to do the right thing. The Super Rugby now has an independent commission, now has its own CEO who's now in place, but it still needs to have a level of marketing that was the norm 20 years ago. And when 20 years ago Super Rugby was being spoken of as being the best provincial rugby in the world, it just was. There was no argument about that. You couldn't say that now. And what has happened is that if Super Rugby and the Sanzar nations got a bit of a jump on professionalism in the 90s and the early 2000s, Europe has certainly caught up now. And what was working, where Australia and New Zealand were being innovative and were always on the front foot of attack, that's been caught up now. Even in Japan, League One, in terms of their professionalism, the way they run their competition is actually really admirable, and you'd love to see some of that come into Super Rugby now. Major League Rugby in the States is going to be a genuine thing in the next few years. We're already seeing club players in Sydney and Brisbane who decide that's time to see the world, whereas once upon a time they might have gone and played club rugby in Ireland or Scotland, or played lower level in France or Italy. They're going to the States now because they can earn a bit of money. Culture's pretty similar, and they're being paid, as I say, to almost play professionally. So that's going to become a thing. Australia and New Zealand have got to work out what they want Super Rugby to be, and it's got to happen actually pretty soon and pretty quickly. Otherwise, there's going to be some really uncomfortable conversations in a few years' time if nothing is done, and that who knows what that could look like. What I do know is that neither country can afford to just run a domestic only competition. They will bleed players straight away. And the domestic game will just won't disappear, but it won't be great. So they need each other, but they need Super Rugby to be something that it just definitely is not at the moment.
I think the one thing that you mentioned there that I think Super Rugby at the moment is missing to a degree is the physicality of it, like you mentioned with the South African teams. And then also defense seems to be a bit of an afterthought. It's all about running and exciting and looking good and everything. And then I want to use the term flatter to deceive in terms of, when you now pitch up for a test as Australia or even New Zealand to a degree, then, okay, it's not really that, it's a bit more physical than we expected. But on the subject of flattering to deceive, I think South Africa is now being caught out a little bit with this physicality of ours in the URC. This past weekend, for example, in the Champions Cup, we were taught a lesson in physicality. I mean, how many of our players ended up in hospital, was out for the rest of the season? These guys haven't only caught up, they've learned the lessons and are sort of ahead of the South Africans. And we're worried about it. I think I'm going to have a talk about it later this week as well, about the fact that we don't have the depth. Should we even compete in these European competitions and the likes? What do you think about that side of it?
Yeah, that's an interesting one, because there would definitely be opinions in the UK and France probably, and probably Ireland as well, who said, well, should the South African teams be in what is essentially European competition? The team managers and the accountants in each club having to pick up the bill for travel would probably make that argument, probably pick up that argument as well. So yeah, that's interesting that you say that. The Champions Cup, the Heineken Cup as it was, used to be, was often my only real taste of European provincial competition, because that was the knockout games of those was worth watching. Now it sort of feels like it's become this bloated thing of there's too many teams, there's 2 tiers to it. Let me know when it's the semi-finals, and then I'll tune in, sort of thing. So it's interesting that you say that. It's interesting as well that you think that you don't have the depth, because looking from afar, it's South African depth has been something that
not
Australia and New Zealand would love to have, but yeah, maybe not at franchise level. And that's an interesting thing, because you've still got this thing where, the Curry Cup's being played in the traditional, dare I say it, Southern Hemisphere season, but obviously the URC teams play in what's effectively our summer, isn't it? So, you really are playing rugby 12 months of the year in South Africa, and sometimes I actually wonder how on earth you managed to do it.
Well, we don't. That's the point. That's what Jake White is trying to, knock into our heads repeatedly.
Yeah.
Like you said, the guys had to play Curry Cup, for example. They have to have 8 weeks consecutive rest leave. Consecutive. Not the Springboks. The Springboks are a special case. They can break it up into 2 weeks here or 3 weeks there.
Yeah.
The point is, you only have 55 players contracted. There's 85 million rand budget cap. If you look at Toulouse, they almost have that budget in dollars, never mind in rand. I mean, $49 million they spent on players last year. How can you possibly... I know they play more games. Yes, I know that. But still, one weekend you're playing in, like last week against Saracens, we played in some sort of a storm that I've never seen the likes of. Next coming week, it's going to be 38 degrees in Pretoria.
Yeah.
It's not logistically, doesn't make this logistical sense, practical sense, maybe a bit of an ego thing. But I think, when we won a USC with the Stormers, we didn't play in the Champions Cup. So, we didn't have this with Champions Cup for that matter. Sorry,
you're being punished for your success now, aren't you?
Yeah, but I mean, if you want to promote us or pat us on the back, give us a chance to make the playing field more even. It's not the same thing. I don't agree. But listen, I digress.
I think they could. Yeah. I think they could actually bring some of the prestige of the Champions Cup back by actually shrinking it and actually making it hard to get into. Because at the moment it's nearly too easy.
I agree with that. But let's talk about the main thing that we're all concerned about. And for the first time in my entire life, I supported an Australia team. I must be honest, I felt a week afterwards I had to check my medication and everything. But that's what happened when Australia went overseas. I was really rooting for them, to maybe get the Grand Slam. And then they sort of petered out towards the end. But that team compared to the team that played in the World Cup last year, no comparison. I mean, at least it's, thank goodness they're coming back. We need a strong Australia. That's the feeling over here in South Africa.
Yeah, and it's the feeling here in Australia too. And it's been wonderful to see, but it's been a relief to see it. That's the overwhelming feeling about it. I thought a Grand Slam was going to be hard work. Even if the Wallabies managed to beat, Wales and Scotland in the middle, England and Ireland at each end of that tour was going to be hard work. 4 wins in 4 weeks. It's hard work, and so I was very deliberately. There wasn't a lot of Grand Slam talk on the podcast. Certainly none leading into it. Very, very little mention of it during the course of the spring tour. But what changed things was that win over England at Twickenham. No doubt about that. Going into that game, I thought, they definitely could push England because England were in a bit of a state themselves. but the way that they not just competed, but genuinely dominated for periods of that game, and they put themselves in a position to win it, and then they put themselves in a position to lose it, and they did that interchangeably 5 times in the last 10 minutes. So it had all the hallmarks of a really, really annoying Wallabies win/loss/win. But the belief that they took out of that into the Wales test the following week, like they absolutely dominated Wales because they knew they had to. They probably let Wales get too close in July. They knew they had to really put a score up on Wales, and they knew they had to do that because of what they'd done at Twickenham the week before. They then get to Edinburgh, and I think I said to Harry at the time, South Africa haven't helped Australia's cause here by actually, giving Scotland a bit of belief. And so by the time the Wallabies get to Murrayfield, that was always going to be a physical game. And there was, a few things didn't go to plan. A few places they let themselves down in, but they still weren't far off winning that game. Like they could have found a win if they were, if just a few things had gone right. Ireland was always going to be the tough one. That was always going to be a tough one. But recent history also says that Ireland and Australia have always matched up pretty well. So, the last time that the Wallabies were in Ireland was 2022. And that was a 5-test tour, and they only lost by 3. So had you have before kickoff said Australia will lose by 3, I would have ripped your bloody arm off in taking that. So the belief that this is brought forward for Australian rugby going into 2025 is huge. There's a real feel of momentum now, and going from 5 Super Rugby teams into 4, there's been a bit of consolidation. New South Wales will certainly be stronger. Queensland will certainly be stronger. The Brumbies will have a strong squad. They've not lost anyone. They've got a few new players, but they've always had that strong core. So there's going to be some really strong competition from the Australian side. So I'm actually looking forward to Super Rugby as a result. What we can't afford is for the Australian teams to start Super Rugby slowly. They really need to launch into it, produce some early wins. They would be described as upsets in New Zealand, no doubt, but whatever. They've got to put those early wins on the board and then have that go into the Lions tour, and you just never know. You just never know. The Lions, as we all know, strong on paper, but trying to pull together 4 national squads into one team, that's hard work sometimes. So really looking forward to that Lions series next year. It's going to be big for Australian rugby on numerous different levels, but Super Rugby's got to be big going into it so that the momentum out of this out of the end of 24 can go forward, because Joe Schmidt has done a fantastic job this year in pulling that team together, pulling that squad together, having a look at a few new guys, but actually instilling a bit of belief into them and a bit of a sense of belonging. They do belong. They can compete at international level, because so many of the guys that have starred this year were cast aside last year. And so there's still so many questions for 2023 that will remain unanswered, I suspect. And I think so many of us now are just going, all right, 2023 happened. Let's just get on with the job. And Joe Schmidt has done that. He's pushed the Wallabies team forward, and it does feel like the game's in a good spot at the moment.
Well, the biggest question is he going to stick around, number one? And secondly, Andy Farrell, Joe Schmidt, ex-Ireland, one's sort of the mentor to the other. They know each other very, very well. That's sort of set up very nicely.
And that was what was so interesting about the last test there in November. There was so much of that game was, this is the game plan, and this is the game plan coming back at it. Like the two teams were almost mirroring each other the way they played. It was really, really interesting to watch. Farrell and Schmidt will be interesting. There's still a lot of Joe Schmidt about the way Ireland plays. So how Andy Farrell can pull together, how Irish is the Lions going to be? Like which English players can he bring in? Which Scots can he bring in? How many Welsh players? 12 years ago, it was a very Welsh-dominated Lions side. It was a question of, would there be any Scots on the tour even at that point? There weren't many Irish. There was a few, but maybe not enough. this year, it's obviously next year it's going to be a very different dynamic, but he's still got to try and pull together 4 national squads, and that's always the biggest juggle, the biggest challenge of a Lions tour.
The thing with Joe Schmidt, I'm taking up a lot of your time here. Sorry for that. There was so much damage done last year with this knee-jerk decision to get rid of Dave Rennie, bring Eddie Jones in, who never took that job seriously, let's be honest here.
No.
He just screwed Australia over.
We've discovered this in hindsight.
Yeah. And I mean, there's so much, not just to rebuild, but to repair the damage, get the rugby popular again and everything. Do you think Joe Schmidt's going to stick around long enough for that? Is that his plan, or is he think someone else will have to step in? Because one thing I did notice, you guys sort of got your house in order, new CEO and everything else. That makes a big difference.
Yeah, the answer to the question is we hope so. He's signed to the end of the Lions tour, and that was always the case, and it was always the case of, let's hope he sticks around, because it's not an 18-month rebuild. And I'm quite sure I have said to Harry, there's an argument that even come the 2027 World Cup in Australia, that they still might not be, quite good enough. But it certainly feels like Australian rugby needs Joe Schmidt to stick around and not finish the job, but at least push the job to the next point. The Lions tour isn't the end of the journey, certainly. And hopefully the successes that he's managed to have on this spring tour, these November tests, after what was an up and down rugby championship, no question. Hopefully these November successes have rekindled the coaching fire within Joe Schmidt. I've heard him say a few times in interviews that he's not great at retiring, evidently. He hasn't been able to do it very well. So, I hope that the inner coach in him, and this is a very selfish angle to take as an Australian rugby fan, because his reasons for signing a short-term contract, his family situation is well known, and no one would begrudge him putting family first. But if there's a way that we can actually help the Schmidt family whilst also helping Australian rugby, that's actually what we want.
Yeah, a win-win.
Absolutely. If we can find a way to make it work, let's, for God's sake, find that way.
Well, I admitted to supporting the Australian team, begrudgingly or by accident. I realized I was supporting them, and I had to go double check. Like I said, I didn't. Like Harry says, you only realize after, when the game starts progressing, who you're actually supporting, and that's exactly what happened to me. Talking about that, supporting a team that's not your own. Your thoughts on South Africa maybe winning a third back-to-back World Cup under Rassie?
Yeah, you couldn't rule it out at this point, could you? I just said only a few weeks ago, the thing that you can only help but admire about what Rassie has done in 2024 is that just about every other team in the top 10 around the world has had some level of, if not rebuild, it's a refresh. If not refresh, it's a rejuvenation. There's some level of, 4-year World Cup cycle. First year out is always the bottom step, we go again. South Africa haven't done that. What he has done is bring in some new players, but they were players that were going to play international rugby at some point in the next 2 years anyway. He's probably used a lot of players. What he's been able to do now, though, is he's now working 2 and 3 weeks ahead. So, even I need you to start on the bench this week because I need you for Ireland next week. I need you for New Zealand next week. The fact that it's really hard to know who the first choice number 9 is in South Africa right now. That's a position that I think any supporter around the world would love to have. So the level of depth that he's been able to build at so many different positions is actually quite incredible. And so for South Africa to in their first year of World Cup defence to not even miss a beat and maybe take another step forward is actually quite incredible. So everything going towards 2027 right now, I think South Africa are going to stay very much in the favouritism conversation for the next 3 years. I don't think there's any question about that. And the debate will probably be who can be in the next group of teams behind them that can actually challenge. Who's going to be best placed to stop them? Maybe that's actually the bigger question.
Yeah, well, the thing is, you only have to win one game. Regardless of how good the build-up was, whatever. It's one game and then another one and then another one. Yeah.
You've got to get to that game before you can win it, though, don't you? So that's the big question. Who is good enough to get to that game to stop them?
Well, the All Blacks were good enough to get to the World Cup final. Steve Hansen had a lot to say about that apparently being robbed. Just briefly, what's your thoughts on that?
What do they say? Winners have celebrations, losers have meetings. I've bastardized that. That's not the saying at all, but it's words to that effect, isn't it? There would be numerous things that the All Blacks would know that they could have won that game if they did X, Y, Z different, better. They weren't robbed in the game.
No, missed kicks. I agree.
They even ignoring the debate about Sam Cane's red card, there were still kicks that didn't go far enough. There were still kicks that went long. There were still drop balls. There were still missed tackles. They lost the game of rugby ultimately.
One thing I find very challenging, and I'm interested to see how you guys handle it, is having an interview with somebody with two interviewers.
Yeah.
Because you tend to, I tend to, you don't know when the other, because you can't see the body language. You can't see this guy's about to say something. So you either both stay quiet or you both start talking at the same time or talk over each other. That to me is a bit of a challenge, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. It is. And what we have got a lot better at is I'm certainly better. I know when Harry's about to ask something. So us both launching into a question now is actually a fairly rare thing. I've become a lot better at recognizing that. So our dead air is not as bad now as it once was. What we also do now is we actually try not to pre-plan too much. Like we actually try to not take too many prescribed questions in. So we're often just trying to go into a conversation with someone and we'll just sort of say, let's talk about this and let's talk about that. And that's our two segments. And we'll just sort of know that we can sort of throw it in. Sometimes there are certain things that we want to ask and we'll try and communicate that beforehand. But by doing that, by trying to unplan, the conversations have actually become better. They've become more organic.
More conversations rather than interviews.
Yeah, more conversational. Exactly. Yeah. And that's very much what we've said for a long time. We have great rugby chats each week, and that's what we try and think about it. And we think about some of the guys that we've had on. Like we reckon Eddie Jones took 15 minutes to warm up before he realised, oh no, these blokes are actually all right. And so by the end of it, he was opening up a bit more and all that. Whereas the first 15 minutes, you could tell he's thinking, how long am I going to talk to these blokes for? But there was something that we said early on that he laughed at, and we felt him relax. So we've said to people from the outset, we've got no interest in stitching anyone up because A, we don't want to do that. B, it doesn't help us going forward because if we have a good chat with you, we want to come back to you.
Yeah, it spreads. You don't want to burn bridges. I know. Yeah, I agree you.
Yeah. So yeah, that's something that we've become a lot better at. Yeah.
No, sorry. What I do typically, I'm more of the interviewer, so I typically lead the conversation. I would say, but listen, Harry, blah 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 blah, or listen, Brett, so that sort of I lead the conversation.
Yeah. And I do exactly the same thing. That's to me that's radio craft. So
okay.
That's just how you drive it. How I can pick up off the back of the guest. And I know Harry wants to say something, and so I've just got to say, and Harry, this is something that we have spoken to, and because I know that's where he's going. So yeah, we've become pretty good like that.
I speak to John Robbie often. He used to be a British Eyes Lion. I don't know if you know him. It was 702. Was a radio talk show host for 16 years, and the very, very, very interesting guy. And he told me once, he says, the next question comes from the previous answer. I do the same. So about you this morning, I just had basic notes. And then the conversations are sort of, meandered along. And it worked well. And my English didn't run out, thank goodness for that. So I was always about
See, no problems at all. We always say to people, to guests, that the measure of a good conversation for us is how many questions we didn't ask.
Get to. Yeah,
because
I know.
Because if we have scribbled a few down, you'll ask some, but if you don't get a chance to ask everything, then the conversation's actually gone pretty well. So that's always a good sign.
It's happened to me now. I wanted to ask you more about the Brumbies. I've got a long list that I never got around to. But
there you go.
I don't want to go back to stuff as well, because if the conversation's moved on, I don't want to jump back. That kind of a thing.
I've done a few talks at schools and universities and things like that for media students and everything, and I've said, look, my journey into sport media is unconventional, and even early on when I did make the switch, I had a few friends say, are you thinking about like studying again and getting a qualification? And I remember saying at the time, I sort of don't feel like I need to. I sort of feel like if I can just keep working, I'll learn I'll learn the lessons that I need to learn, and that's certainly been true now.
Yeah, I agree. Listen, Brett, I love this. Thank you so much. I'll spend another hour talking to you, but I need to let you go. Thank you for that. And I hope we can do it again. I enjoyed this Lekker Rugby Pod 8-9 combo collaboration, man. That was fun.
No, it's been good. Thank you very much. And as I say, thanks so much for your channel's support this year. You have turned us into YouTubers, whether we were ready for it or not. And it's been great the great thing about what we do in this podcasting world is the connections that you make. And there's, I just said it last week in our last episode, we've got this phenomenal list of guests that we've built up over 3 years, and we've been able to go back to them. That we sort of feel like we can talk to whoever we feel like we need to talk to. And if we can't get to them, we know someone who can. And so, you're very much within our circle now, and we thank you for it. And this has been good fun, mate. Thank you.
This is the Lekker Rugby Pod with Harry Jones and MV Velman.